It was true of the war in Vietnam. It was true of the Central American wars. It was true of South Africa. It was true of the Timorese struggle I was involved in for many years. You pick it, it's always the same. The media pretty much hewed to the government's line, a little pushing, stretching here and there, but it's pretty overwhelming. So take, say, Vietnam, which finally, ultimately became a major popular movement which did influence policy. How did it begin? I can tell you I was involved. In the early 1960s, I started trying to give talks about Vietnam. Actually, I live in Boston, which is probably the most liberal city in the country. The universities, academics, professionals. I would give talks in somebody's living room or in a church with maybe 4 people. We'd have to, if we tried to talk about it, we'd have to bring in half a dozen other issues to try to get a small group of people to show up. By 1965, October 1965, the anti-war activists decided to join in the first International Day of Protest. October 15th, 1965 was called as an International Day of Protest against the war in Vietnam. There were big demonstrations all over the world. We decided to try to have a demonstration in Boston, on the Boston Common. That's the standard place for public meetings and so on. It was broken up violently. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. Nobody could hear any of the speakers. The only reason we weren't killed was there were lots of state police around who didn't like what we were saying, but didn't want bloodshed on the Boston Common. You take a look at the Boston Globe the next day, the leading liberal newspaper in the country. Bitter denunciation of the demonstrators. How dare these unpatriotic demonstrators say, let's not bomb North Vietnam and so on. Congress, the same. Liberal congressmen, Mike Mansfield, others, same denunciations. The next International Day of Protest was in March 1966. We realized we couldn't have a public open protest, so we organized it in a church. Church was attacked. Tin cans, tomatoes. And you have to remember what was happening then. In 1966, there were 250,000, almost 300,000 American troops in South Vietnam. South Vietnam had been practically destroyed by then, and the war was expanding to North Vietnam, and it wasn't known then, into Cambodia and Laos. And at that point, it was almost impossible to have a public protest without violence. Well, a couple of years later, things have changed. And the same is true in every other issue. I testified at the United Nations on East Timor in 1978. The press wouldn't even come, didn't want to hear about it. The U.S. was providing almost all of the arms to Indonesia for a huge massacre, virtually genocidal. But the press just wasn't interested. And who cares, you know? But finally it got out. You know, there was significant pressure or something happened. It can be the same this way. On the first issue, U.S. policy is like that of every other great power. There are what are called national interests. They have nothing to do with the nation. They have to do with centers of power within the nation. So the national interest is not to protect the population. It's easy to demonstrate that. I won't go through the details. But policy is designed to protect and expand state power and the power of concentrated, the domestic concentration of powers in the United States. That's mostly the corporate sector, various sectors of it. And policy is designed for that end. Well, you look at the history of U.S.-Israel relations, and it conforms pretty well to that. In 1948, the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, military, were quite impressed by Israel's military victories. And they described Israel as potentially a significant U.S. base in the Middle East. In fact, they described Israel as the second largest military force after Turkey, NATO member, and a potential valued ally. Very significant to the most significant issue of the United States is the oil reserves of the region. They were regarded as stupendous source of strategic power, greatest material prize in world history, mostly in Saudi Arabia, also in the Emirates. But a lot of documents have released to Saudi Arabia made it pretty clear that they were not going to object to U.S. support for Israel. They had their own reasons, which we could go into. And so it continued. It was not a very intimate relationship, and there were conflicts, like in '56. But in 1958, when there was a real problem for the U.S. and Britain in the Middle East, what happened is that in Iraq, the British-run government was overthrown by a military coup. That was the first break in the Anglo-American condominium over Middle East oil, and that was taken very seriously. The U.S. sent troops to Lebanon. They were apparently armed with nuclear weapons. The British sent troops to Jordan. It was quite a major reaction to that. Israel was the only state that cooperated with the United States. You look at the internal U.S. records, which are declassified, they recognize that Israel was the one cooperative state. In fact, the CIA came out with an analysis in '58 saying that support for Israel is a logical corollary of our opposition to what they call radical Arab nationalism. Radical means independent. That was the real enemy. By then it was Nasser's Egypt. 1967, there was a major change. Israel performed a huge service to the United States, enormous. And U.S. policy toward Israel totally changed and reached pretty much its present state. What happened, if you look back, was there was a major conflict between two forces in the Arab world. Radical Islamic fundamentalism based in Saudi Arabia and secular nationalism based in Egypt. During Britain's dominance of the region, it had generally supported radical Islamic fundamentalism, and the U.S. took that over for good reasons. The real enemy is secular nationalism. They don't mind radical fundamentalism. There was a war going on in Yemen between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Israel pretty much smashed secular nationalism. It was a tremendous gift both to Saudi Arabia and to the United States. And it solidified a relationship that was already reasonably friendly and created essentially the current situation. There's no time to run through the rest of the record, but it's essentially like that. Actually, we saw an interesting illustration of it just a couple of weeks ago. You remember in the midst of Operation Protective Edge, when Israel was smashing Gaza, the attack was so extreme they were beginning to run out of munitions. It's a very heavily armed country. So they appealed to the United States for more munitions. And munitions were, in fact, transferred to Israel by the Pentagon in the middle of the fighting. They were transferred from stocks that the United States pre-positions in Israel for use by U.S. forces. That's one of innumerable indications of the nature of the alliance. And there's much more like this. One of the most interesting leaks from WikiLeaks, which didn't get the attention it should have, was a list of highly significant strategic locations, so significant for the U.S. that we have to protect them at all costs. One of them was right outside Haifa, Rafael Military Industries, which is a major advanced military industrial installation, one of the places where they pioneered drone technology, for example, is so closely linked to the United States that Rafael actually transferred its business operations to Washington, where the money is. Very tight linkages. The same with capital flows and many other things. So the United States is pursuing the interest you'd expect of a great power. On the other hand, what do the Palestinians offer the United States? They're weak. They're powerless. They have no wealth. They have only the most tepid support from the Arab rulers, and they have to make some gestures of support to quiet their own populations, but nothing real. So no power, no wealth, therefore no rights. Those are, we may not like it, but those are the laws of international relations.